I thought I knew my girlfriend was rich. Then she took me home, and I realized I was never meant to belong. I had known Zoe was rich in the way people casually say they're rich. Like when someone mentions a nice neighborhood or a vacation home. As if those things are just background details instead of defining features of an entire life. For a long time, I thought that was all it was. A level of comfort I didn't share, but didn't need to fully understand. Zoe herself was easygoing, grounded, funny, in a quiet way. And never once acted like someone who had grown up above consequences or limits. That illusion lasted until the car slowed down in front of a gate that looked less like an entrance and more like a border crossing. On the other side of it, the driveway stretched forward, curving out of sight, lined with stone walls that were older than my grandparents and iron bars thick enough to feel permanent. When Zoe reached across the console and pressed a small black button without even glancing up, the gates opened smoothly and silently. I specifically remember thinking that no one who lived like this ever had to knock. The driveway itself took several minutes, long enough for my initial disbelief to settle into something closer to dread as the landscaping started looking more controlled. Finally, the house appeared, massive and pale and symmetrical, sitting on a hill like it had been designed to look down on anyone approaching it. Zoe called it a house. It was a mansion by any honest definition, with multiple wings, balconies framed in stone, massive windows, and a scale that made me feel smaller with every foot we drove closer. I parked where Zoe gestured on a circular drive already occupied by cars that cost more than everything I owned combined. As I stepped out, the silence hit me first. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that exists because sound, like everything else, is controlled here. Everything smelled clean in an artificial way, like money had removed the possibility of decay. Zoe seemed relaxed, like this place was simply another room she had left and returned to. I tried to mirror her composure, even as my chest tightened and my brain began quietly inventorying every visible difference between me and the world she came from. I had worn my nicest clothes that now felt like a costume from a different era. As we walked toward the entrance, I noticed cameras embedded discreetly into stone. Their security didn't announce itself, but made it very clear that nothing happened here without being recorded. When the front doors opened before we even reached them, I realized that privacy here was probably a myth. Inside of the house was even worse. Not louder or flashier, but controlled, curated, and enormous in a way that didn't invite exploration so much as discourage wandering. The hallways stretched in directions that suggested entire lives existed beyond them. I caught glimpses of staff moving quietly, avoiding eye contact, and it struck me that the house wasn't empty, even when it felt silent. It was run like a machine that didn't require acknowledgement. Zoe's parents were waiting for us. Her father stood first, tall and composed. He was the kind of man who didn't rush because nothing had ever required him to. Her mother followed more slowly, assessing before engaging. Her expression pleasant, in a practiced, dissonant way that made it clear warmth was optional here. Introductions happened. Names were exchanged, and polite acknowledgements were made, but it all blurred together for me because I was already aware that I was being evaluated. I wasn't just Logan. I was Zoe's choice. Dinner was announced, and we moved into a dining room that felt closer to a boardroom than a place where families actually ate. The table was long enough to physically separate us. The lighting was soft, but directional, highlighting faces while leaving corners of the room in shadow. I sat where I was indicated, careful not to touch anything unnecessarily, and fully aware that every movement I made stood out simply because it didn't belong to the choreography of the space. The food was immaculate. Different courses were appearing and disappearing without explanation. While I ate, I noticed how little anyone spoke. Not because of tension, but because silence was normal here. When conversation did happen, it was measured. It was full of references to investments, properties, plans, and other things that existed at a scale I had no frame of reference for. When questions were directed at me, they weren't curious, they were diagnostic. Where I grew up, what my parents did, what my plans were. Each answer felt like another small mark on an invisible ledger, and I could sense that none of them were the right ones. Zoe squeezed my hand once under the table, almost apologetically, and that small gesture told me more than any words could have. Suddenly, sitting there in that massive room surrounded by wealth so normalized it had become cold, I realized this visit was not about meeting me. It was about confirming something her parents already believed. That night, lying in the guest room that was larger than my first apartment, I couldn't sleep. Not because the bed wasn't comfortable, but because comfort here felt conditional. Like it could be revoked at any moment without explanation. The ceiling stretched high above me, and I kept thinking about how even rest felt performative in a place like this. As if the house itself was watching and waiting to see how I would exist inside it. Morning came quietly. No alarms, no street noise, no evidence of a world beyond the property. Just light filtered through heavy curtains, and the faint awareness that things were already happening elsewhere in the house without my involvement. When I eventually made my way downstairs, I realized I was late. Not by any stated standard, but by an unspoken one. That alone was enough to make me feel out of step. Breakfast was already arranged, not cooked, but presented. Everything was set with intention, and I again became aware of how little Zoe actually spoke when she was here. Her personality softened, as if she were conserving herself. Her parents appeared in stages, already engaged in their day, and as I sat there, I began to notice patterns. Her father rarely looked directly at me, but he always knew where I was. Her mother asked questions that sounded casual, but were designed to funnel me into narrower and narrower explanations, clarifying boundaries I hadn't realized existed. Everything here was about control. The house, the staff, the schedule, the silence, the way doors closed behind you automatically, the way conversations ended without resolution. At one point Zoe excused herself, and for the first time since arriving, I was alone with her parents. No confrontation happened, yet the air shifted. I became aware that this was the moment they had been waiting for. Her father finally addressed me directly, not with hostility, but with certainty. He was speaking as someone accustomed to reality, aligning with his expectations, outlining concerns that weren't accusations so much as conclusions already reached. He talked about compatibility, about pressures, and about how their family operated at a level that required stability. He didn't say I was a problem, he just implied that I was a risk. Her mother followed, explaining how Zoe had always been sensitive and how she tended to idealize experiences that felt normal to other people. How relationships like ours often burned brightly and then collapsed under weight they weren't built to carry. They weren't threatening me. They were explaining the inevitability of my removal. I sat there in silence, understanding that any defense I offered would only confirm their assessment. The problem wasn't anything I had done, it was who I was, where I came from, and what I couldn't provide. When Zoe returned, the conversation shifted seamlessly like nothing had happened. I understood then that this was how things worked here. The rest of the day passed in a haze of subtle exclusions. Plans were made without including me. References to future events that assumed Zoe's availability alone. Casual reminders of obligations, expectations, and paths that were already laid out. Zoe tried to stay close, but I could feel the pressure on her, and it scared me. Not because I thought she would choose them over me, but because I realized how exhausting it must be to resist them. By the time evening came, I felt hollow. This wasn't a family that fought, it was a family that waited. As I stood in that immaculate house, aware that every comfort came with a cost, I began to understand that the conflict here wasn't loud or dramatic or explosive. It was quiet and designed to make people like me leave on our own. By the third day, I understood that nothing in that house happened by accident, including how uncomfortable I was becoming. It wasn't overt hostility or obvious exclusion. That would have been messy and unnecessary. Instead, it was the accumulation of small, deliberate inconveniences. The kind that felt easy to dismiss individually but crushing when experienced. All at once, my phone signal was weak in most parts of the house, as if my life beyond the property was slowly losing relevance the longer I stayed. The guest room door was always closed when I returned to it. My belongings neatly arranged and moved just enough to remind me that nothing here was truly mine. Not even the space I slept in. Meals happened whether I was present or not. Plans were discussed around me, not with me. At one point, I realized an entire afternoon had passed without a single person addressing me directly. Zoe noticed, of course. I could see the strain in her, the way she seemed to be constantly recalibrating, choosing her moments carefully and measuring her reactions. Was like she was walking through an emotional minefield that she'd memorized as a child, but never fully diffused. We spent time together in brief moments carved out between obligations. In those moments, she was herself again.
Okay.
Warm and familiar and quietly apologetic in ways that didn't require words. She didn't need to explain her parents' behavior. I could see the pattern clearly. They weren't trying to scare me off. They were trying to exhaust me. The house itself seemed designed to amplify that exhaustion, its silence forcing me inward, leaving me alone with thoughts I couldn't distract myself from. Even the luxury felt isolating because nothing here had ever required compromise, and I was made entirely of compromises. That afternoon, Zoe was called away for what was described as a family discussion. I wasn't invited, obviously. Instead, I was directed toward the library. The books were curated more for appearance rather than reference. I sat there alone for hours, watching the light shift through tall windows, listening to the faint hum of activity elsewhere in the house, and understanding that this was intentional too. When Zoe finally returned, she looked drained. Her shoulders were tight, and her expression was guarded in a way that told me something had shifted. She didn't have to say much. I could feel the distance already forming, not between us emotionally, but as if the space around us was being rearranged to make closeness inconvenient. That evening, her parents hosted a small gathering. Not a party or event, just enough people to remind Zoe of the world she belonged to. People moved through the house, effortlessly, and spoke the same language of ambition and legacy and long-term planning. This was her ecosystem, and I was just an anomaly. And no one was rude to me. They simply treated me like a temporary fixture. I realized how powerful that tactic was, because it didn't give me anything to push back against. You can fight rejection and argue against hostility, but you can't argue with being ignored out of existence by the end of the night. I knew I was being phased out, and the most frustrating part was that it was working. Not because I wanted to leave Zoe, but because staying began to feel like a violation. I was disrupting a system that functioned perfectly without me, and every signal I received told me that the most dignified thing I could do was remove myself, quietly. That night, as I packed my bag, I understood that no one was going to ask me to go. They didn't need to. They had already made staying unbearable. The inevitable conversation happened the next morning. Zoe had gone out early, something about an appointment, and I was finishing breakfast alone when her father joined me. He sat across the table with the same calm presence he always carried. Like time itself adjusted to his pace. He told me he respected my relationship with Zoe, and I understood immediately that respect, in this context, was not admiration, it was acknowledgement. He explained that Zoe was at a pivotal point in her life, that her future involved responsibilities that extended beyond personal happiness. Responsibilities she had been raised to understand, even if she occasionally resisted. He talked about pressure, about scrutiny, and about the reality of living in a world where mistakes were amplified and relationships became liabilities. Then he told me that he didn't think I was prepared for that world. Not as an insult, but a fact. He framed it as protection for both of us, explaining how these situations usually ended, how resentment builds, and how power imbalances warped even the strongest connections. He continued to explain how people like me often became casualties of a system they never agreed to enter. He said Zoe would fight for me, and that was the problem. Then came the offer. Not presented as money for silence or compensation for heartbreak, but as assistance. An opportunity and a way forward that would benefit me without damaging Zoe. A path that would set me up independently somewhere, far enough away that things could cool naturally and the separation wouldn't feel like a loss but like growth. He didn't ask me to leave her, he asked me to make it easier for her to let go, and that was the most infuriating part. He wasn't wrong about the imbalance or about the pressure. He wasn't wrong about how much power he held. He was simply using truth as leverage. I didn't respond immediately. I just sat there, understanding that everything he offered was designed to make me feel mature for stepping aside and noble for choosing the path of least resistance. And I hated how tempting it was. When Zoe returned later that day, she knew. Something had happened. She tried to pull me into one of those quiet moments we'd been surviving on, but I could feel the walls closing in. The house already reclaimed her attention, her time, and her emotional bandwidth. That evening, I walked the grounds alone, realizing that this place didn't need to threaten or coerce or manipulate overtly. It simply waited for people to recognize their place. Standing there surrounded by wealth so immense it had rewritten the rules of human interaction. I understood that the real conflict wasn't between me and her parents. It was between love and infrastructure. And infrastructure, almost always won. The next morning, I didn't wait for anyone to call me to the terrace. Zoe was still asleep, and her parents were already moving through the house, like each step was calibrated to assert ownership over space, time, even thoughts. I stayed low. In the hall, taking in the rhythm of the mansion, and, as I did, I realized that their entire existence operated on a level designed to shape and contain everyone who entered. I walked along the stone paths that framed the property, past fountains that mirrored the sky in perfect symmetry, past hedges trimmed so precisely that they seemed unnatural. I realized, with a sinking mix of awe and dread, that this place wasn't just a home, it was a machine built to maintain order. And any deviation from its choreography was quietly even Zoe, brilliant and independent in every way I'd known, moved here in measured steps, careful gestures, and softening her edges where they might irritate the machinery around her. And yet, as I walked, I understood that there was a choice I hadn't fully acknowledged. Her father's offer the day before was not a lifeline, it was a cage. A cage gilded with promises of advancement, independence, and comfort, but still a cage. It assumed my removal was necessary and inevitable. It assumed that I didn't belong. For the first time, I considered the other option, to stay. Not in defiance, not recklessly, but deliberately. To place myself in the house as if I belonged all along, and exist anyway. To carve a space that wasn't sanctioned by her parents. I wanted to be in a space that wasn't already approved or accounted for. A space that belonged only to Zoe and me. I chose to stay. When Zoe awoke, I didn't try to explain. I didn't announce my decision with grand declarations. I simply stayed where I was, leaning against the balustrade of the terrace, and let her find me. She didn't speak at first either. She didn't need to. The way she approached, the ease with which she fell into step beside me, and the subtle relaxation in her shoulders told me everything I needed to know. We had survived the early judgments. We had survived the quiet pressure. And now, in a space designed to displace us, we were asserting our presence simply by existing. Her parents joined us later for breakfast, as formal as ever, but I noticed a subtle shift. Perhaps it was in the way her father lingered on my expressions, perhaps in the slight tilt of her mother's head. The way she studied our composure at the table. There was a recognition there, imperceptible but real. They could influence us, guide us, and assess us, but they could not erase us entirely. The day unfolded with its usual structure. Meals arrived without announcement, corridors echoed with footsteps that were never mine, and plans continued to be discussed in my presence, but without including me. And yet, somewhere within the rhythm of all that control, Zoe and I discovered a kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with compliance, and everything to do with being present together. We walked through the gardens in the late afternoon, avoiding the staff who moved like shadows through the mansion. We traced the edges of fountains, paused where light spilled onto marble floors, and understood that these stolen moments were ours alone. Not even her parents, or the house itself, could reach into them. By evening, I realized that endurance was a quiet kind of victory. This house, for all its grandeur, could not dictate our connection. Her parents could observe, guide, and suggest, but they could not erase what existed in the subtle gestures between us. The timing in our glances was the small, unspoken reassurance that we were choosing each other against the odds. As night settled, I understood another truth. Love in this house would never be easy or go unobserved, but it could survive. And perhaps, in that survival, it could even thrive in defiance of expectations and infrastructure alike. Night fell over the mansion, like a deliberate curtain, and the house glowed softly. The fountains shimmered, reflecting the vast windows that framed the property with an almost oppressive precision. Zoe and I walked the garden paths again, tracing edges, pausing by pools where the water caught the moonlight and fractured it into impossible angles. I realized that this world, which had seemed designed to remove me, could not touch the space we claimed for ourselves. Not because it had softened, not because her parents had yielded, but because we had chosen persistence. Words were unnecessary between us. They would have drawn attention, broken the rhythm, and exposed us in ways this house thrived upon. Instead, we existed in quiet mutual recognition. A shared understanding that endurance could be more powerful than confrontation. Each step was deliberate, each pause intentional. In that deliberate existence, we created a zone of reality that belonged only to us. Returning inside, I observed her parents from the corner of my eye. They were present, moving through the house with all their usual calm authority. But their assessment of us had shifted slightly. They recognized something subtle but unquantifiable. The two of us together were no longer fully under their control. Not because we had defied them in any loud or dramatic way, but because our unity had created a form of resistance that their influence could not touch. Dinner passed with the same formality it always did. Causes arrived and disappeared with mechanical efficiency. Conversations were measured, and yet, I sat there with Zoe at my side, and I felt the strength that comes from unspoken solidarity. I realized that the mansion, the wealth, and the invisible Pressures her family wielded were all monumental, but they did not define our boundary. We did afterward. We retreated to the upper terraces. The night air was cool, and the stars spread overhead. Like a reminder that some things existed outside even the most controlled environment. Zoe leaned lightly against the doorway to her room. And I stood beside her, feeling the weight of everything we had endured, and how, despite all that, we were still here. We didn't speak of leaving or staying. Instead, we existed in the quiet triumph of presence. Her parents' control and the immense gravity of their world couldn't reach the space. We had carved together, lying later in the guest wing, listening to the distant hum of the house. I realized that we had survived not by confrontation, but by presence, by choosing each other in a world designed to displace us. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was absolute. The mansion remained, grand and imposing. Her parents remained, calculating and precise. And yet, for the first time since arriving, I felt unshaken. Not because the world had changed. Not because their power had diminished. But because we had chosen a space for ourselves that no wealth, no infrastructure, and no expectations could reach. And sometimes, that is victory enough. Zoe's presence beside me was enough. The mansion's shadows stretched long, its lights still glimmered, but within that immense architecture, we had claimed something beyond control. And for the first time, I allowed myself to breathe fully, knowing that our choice had transformed everything. Even if the world itself remained the